How do you build a railroad across 128 miles of open ocean over coral reef and mangrove swamp and channels where the Atlantic meets the Gulf of Mexico, when the concrete has to cure underwater and the construction barges sit in the path of every hurricane that crosses the Caribbean between June and November? I started with the engineering records of the Florida East Coast Railway, filed between 1905 and 1912, and what I found was not a railroad project. It was a construction operation conducted at sea on floating equipment in water from 20 to 30 feet deep, using barges loaded with concrete mixers and steel girders and pile drivers that had to be anchored against tidal currents while crews poured bridge foundations into the ocean floor. The engineers who designed the bridges invented solutions as they went. The workers who built them lived on the water, on floating dormitories called quarter boats, anchored in the open Atlantic in the Gulf of Mexico, exposed to every storm that formed in the tropics. On October 18, 1906, a Category 3 hurricane with 120 miles per hour winds swept through the Florida Keys and hit the construction site. The workers had been moved from their tent camps on the islands to the quarter boats for protection. The storm surge lifted the boats off their anchors and carried them into the open sea. One houseboat anchored on the Gulf side of Long Key carried 150 men. The surge pushed it into the Atlantic Ocean. 83 survived. The rest went into the water and did not come out. A total of 135 railroad workers died in that single storm. The project was not canceled. The man who was paying for it doubled the crews and sent more equipment. The man's name was Henry Flagler. He had co-founded Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller. The railroad across the Florida Keys was his retirement project. He was 75 years old when construction began. He was 82 and nearly blind from cataracts when the first train arrived in Key West. He wept at the station. 14 months later, he was dead. The railroad he built operated for 23 years. Then another hurricane, a Category 5, the strongest ever recorded to strike the United States at that time, destroyed 40 miles of track in a single night, killed over 400 people, and ended the overseas railroad permanently. The machine that cost $50 million and more than 250 lives lasted less than a generation. The concrete arches that held it above the water are still standing. I keep coming back to that detail. The arches survived. The railroad did not. Henry Morrison Flagler was born on January 2nd, 1830 in Hopewell, New York. He left school after the 8th grade and went to work. He tried the grain business and failed. He tried the salt business during the Civil War and failed again. Then he met John D. Rockefeller in Cleveland, Ohio. And in 1867, the two men, along with a chemist named Samuel Andrews, formed the partnership that became Standard Oil. If you watch the pipeline video on this channel, you know what Standard Oil became. Flagler was the strategist. Rockefeller was the consolidator. Flagler designed the railroad rebate agreements that gave Standard Oil shipping advantages no competitor could match. He structured the deals that allowed the company to control 90% of American oil refining by 1878. He was, by multiple accounts, the operational mind behind the most profitable corporation in the world. By the 1880s, Flagler was wealthy beyond any reasonable use for the money. His first wife, Mary, was ill and her doctor recommended Florida. Flagler visited St. Augustine in 1882 and saw a state with extraordinary potential and almost no infrastructure. No decent hotels, no reliable transportation, no way for wealthy northerners to reach the warm coast in comfort. Flagler saw a market and began to build. He purchased small railroad lines and combined them into the Florida East Coast Railway. He built luxury hotels along the route, the Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine, the Royal Poinciana in Palm Beach, and the breakers on the ocean side of Palm Beach Island. By 1896, the railroad reached Miami, which at the time was a frontier settlement of fewer than 300 people. Flagler's railroad and hotels transformed the entire Atlantic coast of Florida from a backwater into a destination. He did not simply develop the state. Multiple historians have concluded that Henry Flagler invented modern Florida. That was not enough. Flagler wanted Key West. Key West, at the far southern end of the Florida Keys island chain, was the closest deepwater port in the United States to the Panama Canal, which the federal government had announced it would build. Flagler understood that when the canal opened, the port closest to it would control trade with Cuba, Latin America, and the Pacific. Key West was that port. The problem was reaching it. Key West sits 128 miles beyond the tip of the Florida peninsula, separated from the mainland by a chain of coral islands, mangrove flats, and stretches of open ocean where the water is 20 to 30 feet deep and the bottom is soft coral and sand. No road connected the Keys to the mainland. No bridge existed. The only access was by boat. Flagler decided to extend his railroad across the open water, island by island, bridge by bridge, from Homestead on the mainland to Key West at the far end of the chain. His engineers told him the scale of the project was unprecedented. Skeptics called it Flagler's folly. The newspapers printed the phrase as though it were the project's official name. Flagler's response, according to accounts from the period, was simple. "It is perfectly simple," he said. "All you have to do is build one concrete arch and then another, and pretty soon you will find yourself in Key West." Construction began in 1905. The engineer William J. Crome surveyed the route, driving stakes into coral rock and mangrove mud across the island chain. Barges delivered steel and Portland cement from the mainland. Supply vessels hauled lumber, aggregate, reinforcing steel, food, drinking water, and tools to construction camps scattered across the Keys. Pigeon Key, a 5-acre island near the midpoint of the route, became a main hub for the crews building the 7-mile bridge. At the peak of construction, 400 workers lived on Pigeon Key alone, making $1.50 a day for 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Flagler, raised by a Presbyterian minister, enforced a strict no-alcohol policy across every camp. To enforce it on Pigeon Key, one of the last sections of deck connecting the island to the mainland was intentionally left unfinished, so that workers could not walk to the nearest settlement to buy liquor. They were stranded on a 5-acre island in the middle of the ocean, building a railroad, sober. The total workforce at peak was 4,000 men, divided into 2 shifts of 12 hours each, working around the clock, 24 hours a day. The town of Marathon, on Marathon Key, was named for the marathon nature of the effort. The conditions were brutal in ways that men who had worked on railroads in the Mountain West and the Great Plains had never encountered. The swamps swallowed their boots. Crocodiles slid off the banks into the water where the crews were setting pilings. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men wrapped their faces in cloth to breathe. Heat stroke killed workers in the subtropical sun. Snake bites killed others. Drinking water had to be shipped in by barge. Fresh food spoiled in the heat before it reached the outer camps. And always, from June through November, the threat of hurricanes. This is one island, one camp, one crew. There were construction sites spread across 128 miles of ocean and coral and mangrove, and every one of them was accessible only by boat, and every one of them was exposed to the open Atlantic on one side and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. Subscribe if you want to see what's in the rest of these records. The bridges were the project, the islands were easy. Laying track across a coral key required grading, ballast, and conventional railroad construction. The hard part, the part that earned the 8th wonder of the world designation, was crossing the gaps between the islands, the channels, and open water stretches where the railroad had to leave the land and travel across the sea on concrete and steel. The railroad required more than 24 bridges. The longest was the 7-mile bridge, which was actually a series of 4 connected spans: the Knights Key Bridge at 6,803 feet, the Pigeon Key Bridge at 5,935 feet, the Moser Channel Bridge at 13,947 feet, and the Passett Channel Viaduct at 9,035 feet. The first 3 sections were built on concrete piers, reinforced with 3/4-inch steel rods driven into the ocean floor. Steel girders, each 80 feet long and weighing 41.5 tons, were lowered across the tops of the piers by crane barges to form the superstructure on which the railroad tracks were mounted. The 7-mile bridge alone required over 30,000 tons of steel and 100,000 cubic yards of concrete. The second most significant bridge was the Long Key Viaduct, Flagler's personal favorite, a 2.7-mile structure built with 186 concrete arches, each spanning 50 feet, rising from piers sunk into the ocean floor. The Long Key Viaduct was used in the Florida East Coast Railway's promotional materials and became the visual symbol of the entire project. The arches, poured from concrete mixed on floating barges and set into forms built in the water, were engineered to withstand tidal forces, storm surge, and the corrosive effect of salt water on steel reinforcing rod. The engineers used a special cement formulation capable of curing underwater. Some accounts specify that the cement was imported from Germany. The concrete was mixed on barge-mounted mixing equipment anchored in the channel, poured into wooden forms, built around the partially submerged pier foundations, and allowed to set while the tides rose and fell around it. The curing process took weeks. The barges could not be moved until the concrete reached structural strength. During those weeks, the barges and the crews that lived on them were anchored in the open water, exposed to whatever weather crossed the Florida Straits. 5 hurricanes struck the Florida Keys during the 7 years of construction. The worst hit on October 18, 1906. The storm had crossed the Caribbean, struck Central America, crossed Cuba, and arrived in the Keys with estimated winds of 120 miles per hour and a central pressure of 953 millibars. When warnings were issued, the construction foremen moved workers from their tent camps on the islands to the floating dormitories, the quarter boats, which were large houseboats anchored in the protected water on the Gulf side of the Keys. The logic was that the boats could ride out the storm better than the canvas tents on the exposed islands. The storm surge proved the logic wrong. 2 large houseboats anchored on the Gulf side of Long Key were torn from their moorings by the surge. One of the houseboats, carrying 150 workers, was swept across Long Key and pushed into the open Atlantic Ocean. 83 of the 150 men on board survived. The other houseboat was carried into Florida Bay and washed back to shore without casualties. 2 additional houseboats carrying 45 men on Lower Matecumbe Key were carried out to sea. The steamship St. Lucie, part of the FEC fleet, sank off Elliott Key with the loss of 25 lives. In total, 135 Florida East Coast Railway workers died in the hurricane of October 1906. Construction equipment was scattered across the Keys. Bridges that had been partially completed were destroyed. Steel girders that had been positioned on piers were swept into the ocean. Newspapers predicted the end of the project. They printed the phrase Flagler's folly as though it had been confirmed. Flagler's response was to double the construction crews and send additional barges, cranes, and cement from the mainland. After the 1906 hurricane, the construction operation changed its methods. The number of quarter boats was reduced. A telegraph communication system was installed along the route to provide storm warnings. Construction was halted during the summer months of hurricane season, a concession to the Atlantic that cost Flagler months of progress every year, but kept his workers off the water during the most dangerous period. The project continued, bridge by bridge, arch by arch, pier by pier, through the hurricane of 1909, which collapsed or swept away 400 buildings on Key West and sank the tugboat Siebel with 11 crew members. Through the hurricane of 1910, which passed west of Key West with winds of 125 miles per hour, measured at the Sand Key Lighthouse. 3 major hurricanes and 7 years of construction, and the project did not stop. Flagler was 80 years old during the 1910 storm. His health was declining. His eyesight was failing. His engineers pushed the crews harder. The 24-hour shifts at the 7-mile bridge became the defining image of the project, and the reason the settlement at the western end of the bridge was named Marathon. On January 22, 1912, the first train of the Florida East Coast Railway departed Miami and arrived in Key West at the Trumbo Point Terminal. Henry Flagler was on board in his private railcar, the Rambler. He was 82 years old. He was nearly blind from cataracts. He could not see the bridges his money had built or the ocean his workers had crossed. When he stepped off the train at Key West to the sound of the crowd that had gathered at the dock, he wept. He had spent 27 years developing Florida's east coast and $50 million extending his railroad across the open sea. The newspapers that had called it Flagler's folly now called it the 8th wonder of the world. Flagler died on May 20th, 1913, at his home in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 83. He had lived long enough to ride his own train to Key West, but not long enough to see whether the railroad would survive what the Atlantic Ocean had already demonstrated it was capable of delivering. The Overseas Railroad operated for 23 years. Trains ran from Miami to Key West and back, carrying passengers, freight, and mail across the bridges and viaducts that Flagler's crews had built from floating barges in hurricane season. The railroad never became the trade gateway to Latin America that Flagler had envisioned. Key West did not become a major shipping port. The Panama Canal opened in 1914, but the trade that flowed through it did not flow through Key West in the volumes Flagler had projected. The railroad was a scenic marvel and a functional transportation link, but it was not a profitable enterprise on the scale its builder had intended. Then the Great Depression hit in 1929, and the Florida East Coast Railway's revenues collapsed along with every other railroad in the country. By the mid-1930s, the federal government was using the Florida Keys as a work relief site. Unemployed World War I veterans, some of whom had been part of the bonus army that marched on Washington in 1932 and was dispersed by the U.S. Army under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were sent to camps in the Upper Keys to build bridges for the Overseas Highway, a road that would parallel Flagler's railroad. 3 camps housed 695 veterans on the Keys, on Lower Matecumbe Key and Windley Key and other islands in the Upper Keys. The camps were ramshackle. The housing was flimsy wooden shacks and tents. The veterans were paid relief wages to work on road construction, delivered to and from the work sites by Flagler's Railroad, the same railroad that had been built across the open ocean a generation earlier. On September 2nd, 1935, Labor Day, a hurricane that had formed in the Atlantic east of the Bahamas crossed the Florida Straits and struck the Upper Keys as a Category 5 storm, the first Category 5 hurricane ever recorded to make landfall in the continental United States. The barometric pressure at the center of the storm measured 892 millibars, the lowest ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere at that time. Sustained winds exceeded 185 miles per hour. Some estimates place the peak winds near Islamorada at 200 miles per hour. The storm surge was 18 to 20 feet. The man overseeing the veterans camps, Fred Gent, the Florida director of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, had an evacuation plan. He would call Miami and request a special Florida East Coast Railway train to drive south and pick up the veterans. At 1:59 in the afternoon, Gent placed the call to Miami. The train was not standing by. The Florida East Coast Railway had told Gent previously that if he wanted a train ready to move immediately, he would have to pay to keep one on a dedicated track. He had not paid. The rescue train had to be assembled. It left Miami late. At the Miami River, the drawbridge was raised to let holiday boat traffic through, and the train stopped. At Homestead, the engine had to be uncoupled and turned around so the locomotive would face forward on the return trip, and the train stopped again. At Windley Key, the locomotive cab struck a sagging cable that had been knocked low by the approaching storm, and the train stopped a third time for an hour while the crew freed the obstruction. By 8:30 in the evening, the rescue train reached Islamorada. The storm surge arrived at the same moment. An 18-foot wall of water, carrying sand and debris and the wreckage of every structure on the island, struck the train broadside. 11 of the train's cars were swept off the rails and into the ocean. Only the locomotive and the tender remained upright on the tracks. The engineer survived. The passengers survived. The locomotive had to be barged back to Miami months later. The veterans in the camps on Lower Matecumbe Key and Windley Key were not as fortunate. The flimsy shacks disintegrated in the wind. The surge swept across the low-lying islands and carried men, lumber, equipment, and everything else into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. The sand from the Keys' coral beaches was driven by winds of 185 miles per hour at such force that it stripped the bark from trees, the paint from buildings, and the clothing and skin from anyone caught in the open. Over 260 World War I veterans died. A total of at least 408 people were killed by the storm, with many estimates running to 485 or higher. Bodies were recovered for weeks afterward, tangled in mangrove thickets along the shore, trapped in wreckage, and washed as far south as Flamingo on the Florida mainland. In the subtropical September heat, the corpses swelled within hours. Fearing disease, authorities ordered the dead cremated in stacked wooden coffins on the banks of Snake Creek between Islamorada and Tavernier. with religious officiants presiding. 250 veterans were burned there. In 1965, 30 years after the hurricane, a developer dredging near the Keys pulled up an automobile with 1935 license plates. Inside the car were 5 skeletons. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 destroyed 40 miles of Henry Flagler's railroad. The track was ripped from the bridges, the wooden trestles were torn apart, the embankments were washed away. The concrete arches and piers, the structures that Flagler's crews had poured from floating barges into the ocean floor, largely survived. The arches held. The railroad did not. The Florida East Coast Railway, already weakened by the Depression, could not afford to rebuild 40 miles of destroyed track across open water. The company sold the remaining right-of-way and infrastructure to the state of Florida for $640,000. The state built the Overseas Highway, U.S. Route 1, across the bridges that Flagler's workers had built, widening some of the railroad spans to carry automobile traffic. The highway opened in 1938. Flagler's concrete arches, the ones poured from barges in 20 feet of seawater by men making $1.50 a day, became the foundation of the only road connecting the Florida Keys to the mainland. I started with a question. How do you build a railroad across 128 miles of open ocean? The answer, according to the engineering records of the Florida East Coast Railway, is that you build it with concrete arches poured from floating barges, with steel girders lowered by crane onto piers sunk into the ocean floor, with quarter boats anchored in the path of hurricanes, with 4,000 men working 12-hour shifts for $1.50 a day in mosquito clouds and crocodile swamps and subtropical heat, with a telegraph system installed after the first hurricane killed 135 of them, with construction halted every summer because the man paying for it finally accepted that the Atlantic Ocean was not something you could negotiate with or buy out or crush the way you crushed a competitor at Standard Oil. Henry Flagler spent $50 million in 7 years building the Overseas Railroad. He was told it was impossible. He was told the ocean would take it. He built it anyway, and for 23 years the trains ran. Then the ocean took it, exactly the way the engineers had warned, in a single night with winds of 185 miles per hour and an 18-foot surge, and the railroad that cost $50 million and more than 250 lives was finished. The concrete arches of the Long Key Viaduct still stand in the water off Layton, Florida. The old 7-mile bridge still stands between Marathon and Little Duck Key. The piers are on the National Register of Historic Places. The concrete that was mixed on barges and poured into forms in the open Atlantic more than a century ago has outlasted every storm that has crossed the Florida Straits since. The arches survived. The railroad did not. The highway did. Flagler's workers built the foundation for both, and nobody carved their names into the concrete they poured. The records are still there, in state archives, in company files, in the collections of the Flagler Museum in Palm Beach, and the Pigeon Key Foundation in Marathon, and the Key West Art and Historical Society. We just have to open them. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different, or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the men who threaded 6-inch wrought iron pipe by hand across the Allegheny Mountains built the pipeline that set Pennsylvania on fire, that video is on screen now.